Okay, it's 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody to the December 2024 Arc and His lecture. My name is Sebastian. I am the Vice President of Activities. And before I introduce tonight's lecturer, I have to acknowledge that the Arc and His Society is based out of Tucson, Arizona. One, we would like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham and the Pasquayaqui, and we honor their presence here in the past and today. With that being said, tonight's lecturer is Dr. Adams, Chuck Adams. He's been around for a long time. Started doing archaeology before I was even born. Tonight, he's going to be talking about his research, Homol'ovi I. So with that being said, Dr. Adams, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Hopefully that's visible to everybody. Thanks for...
Can I say one more thing before we start? I'm sorry.
Yes.
I forgot to say that questions will be answered at the end of the lecture. So please, audience, if you can write them in the Q&A section in the bottom of the page. Dr. Adams will answer those after he's done. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks everybody for joining me this evening. I want to talk about something that really often isn't focused on a whole lot in at least Southwest archaeology. That is details about deposits. We think a lot about architecture and chronology and things like that, but this is going to be focused on the details of the archaeological record. So these are the principal arguments I'm going to be making in this presentation. So-called abandoned rooms are in fact active participants in the social life of the Homol'ovi I community and likely many other places in the Southwest and elsewhere in the world. Careful analysis of deposits and artifacts along with determining room use are keys to understanding the engagement with these spaces by the occupants. Some deposits are exceptional in their quantity and diversity of objects they contain. I refer to these as enriched deposits, and they're keys to identifying important places and use or occupation by groups with higher status within the Pueblo. And then ash. Ash is an understudied, underappreciated deposit that we found at Homol'ovi, and it has dual roles as protector and purifier. It's very common and plays important roles in interaction with spaces. And then I'm going to naturally rely on Hopi ethnography to help interpret the meaning of deposition and its association with specific room types. My perspective is that objects or artifacts are social and have lives because they interact with humans during their creation, use, discard, reuse, and afterlife. This can also be said for deposits, structures, and indeed communities. These lives don't end when an object is discarded or a room is no longer used. They simply enter a new chapter in their life history. The archaeological record is what we think of it as and what we call it, where they continue to interact with the living world, both human and other objects and deposits. So objects focus a lot on the context of where objects come from. What are they associated with? What is the nature of the deposit within which they lie? What lies above and below them? Where are they situated in the room? And where is the room situated in the community? And how is this room or space used? A little background information for those of you who aren't familiar with Homol'ovi. It's a research program at ASM that began in 1984, I think May of 1984, so it's 40 years old. The word Homol'ovi is a Hopi for place of hills, mounds, or buttes. It describes the landscape around this part of the Little Colorado River, which is where these 7 villages are situated along a 20-mile stretch that has permanent water flowing in it. Not a lot of water, but it's there all the time. And the has a very broad floodplain in this area, which is suitable for farming. There are 7 recognized villages, Homol'ovi I to 4, Chevelon, Jackrabbit, Cottonwood Creek, and they're about 3 to 5 kilometers apart, and they were occupied. We excavated in all but Cottonwood Creek, Pueblo, small sample sizes for most of the villages. We also did a 30+ square mile survey locating over 350 sites that provide time and space context for the big Pueblos. And for those of you who don't know this, a state park called Homol'ovi State Park was created to protect these settlements, and the villages of Homol'ovi I to 4 are within the park. The cluster, not all the villages at the same time, but the cluster was founded about 1260, and the last occupations were ended around 1400 or a bit later. There's a lot of interaction among the villages that are occupied at the same time, trading of all kinds of things. There's also a lot of interaction with nearby settlement clusters, especially groups living on the Hopi mesas. The founders or settlers that created the Homol'ovi sites are primarily Hopi migrants, and they're primarily from the Antelope Mesa, which is the 4th mesa of Hopi settlement. But there are smaller contributions by groups to the south, Sinawa and Mogollon, and the frequency of these southern groups varies from village to village, suggesting there are enclaves of these groups within the larger northern Pueblo occupants. Farming, both dryland and floodplain, is maize, beans, and squash. A lot of cotton was grown on the floodplain. Cotton needs more water. And this cotton was an important engine in exchange with the other settlements in the region. This is a map showing the main settlements. You can see that they're arranged along both the Little Colorado and, you might argue, I-40, but I-40 I think came a little later than the settlements. So we'll go with Little Colorado River. Homol'ovi I, which is the focus of the talk, is circled near the town of Winslow. And this is an aerial photo of Homol'ovi I at the bottom of the photo, the Little Colorado River with its small flow, and then this enormous floodplain that is farmable by catching water, especially when there's excess water and watering the crops for recession farming primarily. Homol'ovi I, the Pueblo I'm going to focus on today, has about 1,100 rooms, more or less. It's hard to tell because it's so dense. It's up to 3 stories high. We excavated a whopping 69 of them, or 6%. Close to 500,000 artifacts were recovered from these 69 rooms, with about 30% of them having been analyzed so far. The village was occupied from about 1285 to 1400. All the rooms were not occupied at the same time, probably around 500 residents at the maximum. And one important character of Homol'ovi I is that from a Hopi settlement cluster perspective, it would be called a mother village. Mother villages are the largest villages in a group of sites. They're the most long-lived villages typically. They house the most diverse and important ceremonies. And this is based on the concentration of religious structures at both Kiva and non-Kiva at Hopi mother villages, as well as at Homol'ovi I. And then it's situated adjacent to the best farmland with permanent water. So these are all hallmarks of the most important village in the settlement cluster. This is an outline of the site of Homol'ovi I, showing in rectangles and squares the areas that we excavated. You can see that we tried to do a spatial and as well as a temporal sampling of the site. It's a challenge, but I think we did a pretty good job. There are two distinct pueblos that make up Homol'ovi I. The North Pueblo, which is earlier, constructed primarily of stone, and the South Pueblo, which was built quite a bit later, is constructed primarily of adobe bricks, and these are form molded adobe bricks. The chronology of the Homol'ovi sites is well understood and documented. This is what a lot of this work was done by Vince LaMotta in his 2006 dissertation. Dating is based on the percent of genital yellowware of total decorated pottery. The calendar of dates assigned to these percentages are derived from radiocarbon tree ring and tree ring dated pottery types. The four phases are listed there: Tuyuka, early, middle, and late Homol'ovi phase, with the percentage of genital yellowware and the calendar dates assigned to those. Importantly, 90% of the deposits arranged by percentage of genital yellowware are the same order as the physical order of the deposits in structures. So it's a very strong indicator of actual passage of time at the sites. This is just a graphic showing those relationships with specific deposits, going from 100% of, in this case, primarily the locally made Winslow orangeware, and the rise of yellowware from 0% around 1330 to 95% at around 1400. And then there's a small, consistent pattern of White Mountain redware, Zuni glazeware, and a little bit of Roosevelt redware that is present all along, higher in the earlier phases and lower in the later phase. The life history of Homol'ovi III has three primary events. Its founding or establishment in the late 1200s, which is focused in the North Pueblo, where numerous room blocks were built using ladder construction techniques. I'll have an illustration of what that means if you're not sure. These room blocks were founded by social units of related people, clan segments that probably had primary lineages as constituents, and I will go into detail about what a primary lineage is and why it's important later on. And the groups settling these room blocks are, although primarily from north, we also have southern groups joining in as well. So they're always a mixture of the two areas at the Homol'ovi I. Major event in the life history of Homol'ovi I is this what I call reorganization, which lasted for about 20 years in the early and middle Homol'ovi phases. And this involved the destruction and filling of about 150 two-story rooms, with the upper room removed and the bottom room filled. The bottom rooms were often filled with the remains of the upper rooms, but many of them were also filled with dense cultural deposits. And these occur in the North Pueblo. And the remodeling was to level these areas and create open spaces or small plazas. And I'll have a map showing where these are in a little bit. During this period also, the South Room Block was, or the South Pueblo was created, and three sets of rooms enclosed what's called the South Plaza. We also know, based on the utility ware pottery that we find in the middle and early phase, that these migrants from the South also joined in this reorganization of the Pueblo. The last event is the depopulation of Homol'ovi I, which lasted perhaps a decade of slow decline in the 1390s. Mostly habitation rooms over large areas of the village were depopulated. We see closing deposits on the floors of a lot of these rooms. And the expectation is that these three different social processes that are occurring at Homol'ovi I are going to be expressed uniquely and differently in rooms at the site. So this is the Tuyuka phase, the late 1200s village. The long gray lines are room blocks that we know are linear room blocks. This is what a linear room block construction looks like. The outlines of the room block are built continuously first, and then interior walls are added, abutting the earlier outside walls. And these are usually fairly evenly spaced, but not always exactly. That we know there are other linear room blocks, and that over time, going past 1300, this Pueblo eventually was filled in with these types of constructions. By 1350, this is what the North Pueblo looked like. Incredibly dense room blocks, several hundred rooms, 2 stories, 3 stories in some areas. And then with the reorganization that began around 1350, by the late 1300s, this is what the village of Homol'ovi I looked like. Lots of construction over on the south part of the Pueblo, creating the South Plaza. This is a kiva that we excavated, and then where the room blocks were leveled, these are the small plazas that were constructed into those. I should note that there are no kivas in these small plazas. And thanks to Doug Gann, this is a nice reconstruction of what the Pueblo might have looked like in the late 1300s. The kiva and plaza space. These are adobe brick room blocks, and these are mostly stone. One of the things I mentioned earlier in the presentation is that room use is important. We need to understand how rooms were being used at Homol'ovi I, and they can be easily broken down into 2 groups: those that have hearths, and here I'm not talking about kivas, I'm just talking about Pueblo rooms. There are 3 rooms with hearths: habitation rooms, religious ritual rooms, and piki houses. A piki house is basically a habitation room that has a very distinctive hearth, having slabs on just 3 sides with the 4th side left open. And that's because this piki stone, or tortilla stone in this case, lays over the top of this and covers it completely. So the only way fuel can be fed in is through the open side. So one side has to be left open. Otherwise, hearths at Homol'ovi are 4-sided. Religious ritual structures are about the same size as habitation rooms, or slightly bigger. They are distinctive in having kiva-like features of ventilators, benches, and deflectors. So they're taking on the elements of kivas, but they're embedded in room blocks. Religious ritual structures are usually below other structures on the bottom story or the middle story of a 3-story set, while habitation rooms are in the top story. Also, both habitation and religious ritual rooms typically have a lot of layers of plaster because they're used for a long period of time. And there's a fair amount of sooting on these, indicating that they're getting sooted and they're being renewed periodically to cover up the soot. This is a habitation room. Again, the four-side hearth with four sides, floor surface. In this case, this is in the closure assemblies. There's an RV here, a storage bin, and a doorway into a storage room. This is a religious ritual room. It's quite a bit bigger than the habitation room we just saw. It has a bench, which makes it distinctive and a harbinger of being used for religious purposes and not just domestic purposes. Hearth associated with the bench, a later hearth here, and another RV on the floor. So the other three rooms are those that don't have hearth: storage, religious storage, and corn storage rooms. These are all typically smaller than habitation rooms and religious ritual rooms. They only have 1 or 2 layers of plaster. They're connected to habitation rooms, or in the case of religious storage rooms, they may be connected to a religious ritual room. The connection is through either a doorway or a roof hatch, connecting them vertically. Religious storage rooms are identified by the presence of enriched deposits and artifact assemblages. And I'll define what these mean in a little bit, but they're high concentrations of archaeological material culture. Corn storage rooms and mealing rooms are just that. They're used for storing of stacks of corn or for grinding corn. And I should note that room uses can change. They don't change a lot on Homol'ovi I, but they do a little bit. And this is done by either adding or sealing hearths. Storage rooms are the most prone to being changed. Another important point is that rooms are gendered, and this is based on Hopi Pueblo ethnography. I'll talk about that a bit more. Here's a storage room with a doorway to probably a habitation room next door. Here's a sketch of a mealing room in the South Pueblo of Homol'ovi I with 6 mealing bins, 3 each facing each other. This was almost certainly used for preparation for religious ceremonies rather than just day-to-day activities. So now I want to talk a little bit about ethnography and its relationship to what we see at Homol'ovi I. First of all, the household. Every society has households. They vary in size and composition. And at both Hopi and at Homol'ovi I, they can be seen architecturally through connections between rooms by either doors to rooms on the same level or through hatches to rooms above or below them. Thus, households reside in multi-room, multi-story sets, always having at least one habitation room. They're occupied typically for multiple generations. And minimum, they have a habitation room, a storage room, and often other specialty rooms. A typical household in Homol'ovi I occupies 6 rooms. Hopi are matrilineal and matrilocal, which means that females in these households belong to the same lineage and clan, and the responsibility to continue use of the space, the habitation room, is passed to the youngest daughter, ideally. And so it lasts through generations, which is why we have lots of layers of plaster on these structures usually. Also, clans are named and they're important sources of identity. I should note that clans and lineages are ranked in terms of power and prestige. And I would expect the architectural record of Homol'ovi I would suggest that the architectural record suggests that these social elements were present. This is a colorized photograph of the third Mesa village of Arrivie about 1900, showing what we might expect the Homol'ovi going to look like, with a plaza, kiva over here. And you'll notice that entrance into rooms, with this one exception, which is a remodeling, climbed the ladder and entered through a hatch into the front room. This is illustrated here. This is H is for a habitation room. And this is just a example of a set of rooms with habitation rooms on the first floor or the front floor, religious ritual room underneath the habitation room, for the need to have a restricted access to it. The storage of objects used in the rituals back here, and then this is a regular storage room. And there are many different varieties of these that can be created. One thing that is not mentioned a whole lot is the fact that there's a lot of ranking of lineages and clans at Hopi and in Pueblos in general. Clans and lineages are ranked by power and status based on their control of ceremonies, the performance and scheduling and objects used in certain ceremonies, and also access to the best farmland in the area. This is all rainfall dependent farming at Hopi. And within the clan, there are differentiations among primary, marginal, and common lineages. The primary lineage cares for the objects used in the ceremony they control. The objects are stored in a dedicated room, which at Homol'ovi I call a religious storage room, is accessible only through a habitation room occupied by the clan matriarch, who is the senior female member of the primary lineage. And Hopi refer to this habitation room and its affiliated room as a clan house. And so I'm going to use that term as well. Some ceremonies are not planned or performed in kivas. Instead, ceremonial rooms are embedded in the village and are controlled or accessed by the house of the primary lineage. We see a lot of this at Homol'ovi I. Lineages and clans who control the most important ceremonies are referred to as pavansinom, and pavansinom are further ranked in the three levels, which I'm not going to get into. It's way too complex for me to expect to be able to find in the archaeological record of Homol'ovi I. But we should be able to find people that have more status and social power at Homol'ovi I. Talking about gender a while back, because habitation rooms of all types are owned by women in Hopi society, they are considered female. Corn grinding and piki houses are also female for obvious reasons. Kivas and religious ritual rooms are male because males, by virtue of their relationship to powerful females, plan and perform nearly all ceremonies using these structures. Storage rooms can be either gender and might be considered gender fluid. These are the rooms whose use changes most often. So the expectation that I have is that in terms of objects left in these rooms, it will be more likely to conform to their gender roles. So in a room that's being purposely filled by adjoining social units, habitation rooms would have more manos, matatis, piki stones, and pottery vessels. And male spaces would have axes, projectile points, ornaments of shell and bone, and so forth. In terms of identity and identifying social units, when a group migrates, it may include the primary lineage, which we've just talked about, and their ceremonial totems. This is a clan segment and may include other related lineages. You need to establish a group identity to be able to successfully petition for entry into new communities. So when groups are migrating from the Hopi villages or from areas near Flagstaff or the upper Little Colorado River area, If they're primary lineages, they have totems, they have certain status, and they are considered more powerful members that would be welcome to join a community. Totems are never left behind unless the social group ceases to exist or there's a split in the village, such as happened to the Rive. So in a village as long-lived as Homol'ovi I and its tremendous size, we expect social elements similar to what we find at Hopi, such as clan houses and status differentiation. So the question is, how do we use social identity and social power situated in artifacts, deposits, and rooms to identify clan houses, the presence of highly ranked groups who use them? I think deposits will help us, and that's, of course, what this lecture is intended to focus on, how we can use deposits to answer some of these questions. So by looking at what is deposited in rooms and how it's deposited, we get a sense of how they're being treated in their afterlife. And remember, these rooms are considered to be members of the community, living members of the community that are being interacted with on a regular basis because things are being put into them consciously. So by what we find in these rooms and how the rooms were used, we get a sense of what role they played in the community. So the expectation is that spaces were not treated equally in their afterlife, and that the differences are related to the social roles of these spaces prior to closure that were maintained afterwards. So how do we measure these things? Well, I want to step back just a little bit and talk about how we think about deposits at Homol'ovi. In the mid-70s, I worked at the first Mesa village of Walpi. I lived in First Mesa for 18 months. And while working there, I discovered what an active role rooms had in the community, even when they hadn't been occupied for decades. And that many of these rooms were having deposits and objects placed in them during the period when they were so-called abandoned. And these objects and deposits reflected the role that these rooms continued to play in the Walpi community. So my approach at Homol'ovi has been to assume that every human-caused deposit has potential social meaning. Doesn't mean everyone does, but we won't know that unless we document every deposit and keep it separate from all the other ones. So at Homol'ovi, each deposit is assigned a number and is the focus of the analysis of the project. Keep track of every object and sample, and we pay close attention to the relationship of each deposit has to the one above it and below it, and the characteristics of the deposit itself, not the objects, but the deposit. Whether it's ashy or not, whether it has architectural material in it or not, how dense the material is, and of course, what the objects are as well. The total of deposits for each room is compared to other rooms to provide an understanding of its post-occupational life history, the role or roles it played in the community, which sometimes lasted for decades. I don't expect you to be able to read this. This is just an illustration of how we keep track of deposits in the Homol'ovi project. This is a room where we documented 34 deposits that lasted for about 20 years, from 1325 to 1345. On the right side is the timeline. The percentage of yellowware is the way we keep track of that. On the left side is the elevation of the deposits in the room. This is the direction within the room that deposits are oriented. And then these are the three-dimensional relationship of the rooms with each other. So this is the floor surface, which has a number. PD stands for the provenience. 40 centimeters above it, there's an artifact cluster that contains a painted sheep skull. mountain sheep skull. 40 centimeters above that is ashy trash with thin layers of tan sand. 30 centimeters above that, we run into roof debris, alien sand and trash. And this is a cross section of what that room looks like. Now, we didn't keep track of every single cultural or ashy deposit that was described in the Earth matrix before it, but all of them are contained in this little over meter deep cultural material. So you can see that by keeping track of the deposits, we're able to track individual depositional units over a 20-year period of time that were intentionally placed in this structure. And I'll talk about what some of those things are in a little bit. And then after that deposition covered the floor, then the room filled in with alien sand and the melting of the roof and things like that. Here's another structure, the meter deep of dense ashy fill. It's a kiva and accumulated from the yellowware percentages over a period of 40 years. So this room was systematically filled, deposit by deposit, in individual layers over a period of 40 years. And the sum total of the objects in terms of monos, 126 monos and 60 projectile points were recovered. The points ranging from Middle Archaic to Pueblo IV types. So these are monos and projectile points were being placed and repetitively throughout the filling of this, indicating that it was remembered what was in the fill before and being emulated later on, social memory. So what are the attributes of deposits that we need to keep track of? If they represent the engagement with each space after its use life ended. Every one of the 69 rooms that we excavated had Homol'ovi I had cultural material deposited within it, which is remarkable. The deposition documented the roles played by these rooms as important social actors in the daily lives of the occupants who continue to live nearby in these villages. Each deposit has 4 attributes that we traced. First one, the relationship to the deposits above and below them in terms of what the deposit is made of and in terms of objects and material. Composition of the deposit, is it ashy, dense cultural material, etc. What objects occur within deposit, and where is the deposit located in the room? Is it on the floor? Is it in the fill? Is it in a feature? What is the type of the room? Is it a habitation room or a storage room? How is the room accessed? Was it through a door or a hatch? What story of the room are we talking about? And where is the room located in the village? Keep in mind that status sometimes is associated with where a room is located. The combination of deposits, room features, and room access is what Samantha Flad, who did her PhD work using social syntax. And this is just a representation of the models she used to show us social syntax in one room block during the early Homol'ovi phase. The hexagons are rooms, the numbers are room numbers, the color is the use of the room, the lines are open doorways. I just want to point out that during the early Homol'ovi phase, these rooms are not very much activities going on in them. In some cases, they weren't being used at all. But 2 rooms are actively being engaged with. Room 210, which is a religious ritual structure, was filled with ash. It had an ash cone in it. I'll show you a couple of those later on, and was filled with unusual artifacts and intense ceramics, monos, and other things like that. Room 345 had a lesser deposition, but this is a way to keep track of the details of what objects and artifacts are contained in certain structures and the relationship physically to other structures. Social syntax. Another element I want to introduce is the concept of enriched deposits that Ben Lamada and I wrote a paper about almost 20 years ago now. Enriched deposits have one or more of the following: rare or unusual artifacts, unusual fauna, ash, and a high density of material culture. Importantly, enriched deposits occur in fill and not just on floors. So often in my youth as a young archaeologist, we didn't pay any attention to the fill of a structure. We just focused on what was on the floor. A lot is going on in the fill of these rooms. Sam Flatt and I tracked dozens of rare and unusual objects, understanding what their location is, what deposits they occur in. And out of over 3,000 deposits at Homol'ovi I with one or more objects, I identified 188 of these as enriched, having at least 5 of 26 artifact types. And these are the rare and unusual artifacts that we were tracing. Occur in 8 categories: pottery, lithics, groundstone, shell, work bone, fauna, perishables, and other. And you can see, recognize a lot of these things as indeed being fairly unusual. These are the fauna, carnivores, birds, mountain sheep that are rare, also articulated fauna that we find a fair amount of. In terms of phases, there's an more intense occurrence of enriched deposits in early Homol'ovi phase deposits and late Homol'ovi phase deposits. Remember, this is when the reorganization of Homol'ovi I is taking place, and this is when it was being depopulated and a lot of stuff is being left behind because people are traveling 60 miles to their new homes. In terms of room types, not surprisingly, the density of categories of objects is highest in male ritual spaces, kivas, plazas, and materials under plazas, followed by religious storage rooms, which again is not surprising because material related to important objects, ceremonies, and important people was kept in religious storage rooms and oftentimes not retrieved. A couple of examples of closure assemblages that are enriched. This one has 3 cottontails, 1, 2, 3, a couple of large storage jars and a mono. Here's that storage, that habitation room that we saw earlier. Has a Sikyatki polychrome jar, which actually overlies a jar in the room, a Chavez Pass polychrome jar that's buried in the room floor. Mono, an axe, and foot bones. These foot bones are articulated foot bones and probably represent the location of some kind of a skin, possibly used in some ritual performance. And then note that this, in fact, was originally a storage bin, but converted into a shrine. Some of the objects we find in rare and unusual objects. This ladle is pretty cool. It has a bird handle, probably not a functional ladle. Dragonflies on this particular bowl, eagle feathers, and an earthen mound on this jar. And this is an example of a Chavez Pass polychrome jar, like the one under the floor of that habitation room. So what specific things in deposits can we identify, and what do they tell us about room dedication, closure, and afterlives? We recognize the power of the objects within these deposits conveyed that identity and identify important rooms occupied by socially powerful people at Homol'ovi I. We find a lot of ash in the deposits, ash deposits and structures. I mentioned earlier that ash is for protection and purification. It occurs in various types of deposits, cones, thick ash deposits, and pockets or layers of ash. Deposits also can reflect social memory when we see a repetition of deposits and objects within them. Of course, we have enriched deposits where there's dense and complex number of objects within the deposits. This is related to social power because a lot of these objects are totems. Deposits can tell us about, by virtue of the ceramics they're associated with, they can help us understand the social history of the founding, reorganization, and depopulation of Homol'ovi I. The artifacts can also help us with understanding what gender the room that was being filled is considered to be. And then social identity can be expressed because many objects, such as pottery, monos, metades, and projectile points, have unique traits that identify the maker to the community. And so these objects are visible in rooms that are being filled, and people seeing these objects may share an identity with the social ancestors through lineage or clan relationships. This is an example of an ash cone, V, upside down V, or U-shaped. There are four. This is the floor of the mealing room, a mealing bin, and it's covered with dense ash and objects in this ash, and then regular fill, and then another layer of ash, then a dense cultural deposit, one of the two enriched deposits that we find in the room, and then another layer of ash. And so this is a systematic long-term filling of this room with intentional deposition of ash, indicating that they're preserving or purifying this space. Also that there's a memory of ash over a long period of time. And their objects placed in the fill of this room are related somehow to how that room was used in its past life. Another clearer example of an ash cone is here covering the floor of a kiva. Lots of objects found in this ash cone, but you can see it's clearly rounded and intentional. It was dropped through the hatch of the kiva. And then, interestingly, many years later, the roof of the kiva was also burned. Here's the closing material and a secondary beam burned. So the people who were closing and sealing this kiva were obviously very concerned about the power of the ceremonies and objects that were taking place or stored in this kiva, and they used the ash and the burning to protect people continuing to occupy the space or visitors many years, decades, centuries later. So a lot of words here. I'll try to get through it quickly. So our expectations are that clan houses should be recognized based on their location in the village, connection to varied room types, presence of enriched deposits, and in presence of ash, because clan houses are ritually powerful places, and they should have many layers of plaster. The ranking of clan houses or of rooms in the community should use the same attributes we find in clan houses, but with higher ranking rooms in privileged locations near plazas and elevated locations, with heightened enrichment and considerable ash. And these are all symbolic of the social power recognized through deposits and the objects they contain. Deposition should differ for each community event at Homol'ovi I. There should be dedicatory deposits near the foundations or under the early rooms in the founding of the village. Reorganization will have the most intense and heavy use of ash and enriched deposits because new plaza spaces, social and ceremonial spaces are being created. And they're covering non-habitation spaces below. We might see indications of social memory with deposits in the plazas reflecting what was going on in the closed rooms below them. And then we might also see individualized deposits in spaces representing social identity and clan totems that are being left there to dedicate the plazas for certain groups. Ash will be used for a protective element for some of the rooms below the plazas. And for depopulation, expect to see a dominance of habitation rooms. And that things that couldn't be taken on long distance migration, again, we're talking 60 miles. We should see a lot of monos, matadis, whole pots, and just things too big to carry and too heavy to carry. We would also expect to see burning and or ash to seal these spaces because they're the last areas to be used. So this is a cross-section of a room that is part of the early Homol'ovi phase reorganization in the East Plaza. It's what I call a dedication deposits. These are incredibly thick, incredibly rich trash deposits, ash deposits, full of cultural material, 10 enriched deposits included in these spaces, 50 RVs, reconstructible vessels, not very many monos, work bone, ladle handles, points, work shell. And then once those dedicatory deposits were laid in, then the room was filled with sand and adobe and architectural debris. So intentional filling and dedication of these spaces underneath the plaza surfaces, which are way up here. May recognize this cross section from earlier. This is the room that I started out with talking about deposition. This is a religious storage room, and it represents early Homol'ovi phase closure. Has 14 enriched deposits with a few monos, quite a few work bone, and interestingly, 17 miniature vessels in this deposit spread throughout the deposit. So they're repeating the placement of these miniature vessels and other objects over and over and over again through a 20-year period of filling of this room. Middle Homol'ovi phase reorganization. This is a small kiva, or maybe a religious ritual room. The bench here, intense cultural deposition on the floor, followed by, with heavy ash in it, followed by cultural deposition here, another layer stretching across the entire floor, and then architectural debris and such, and then rapid filling of the room with all kinds of cultural material so that they could reach a flattened level. So another floor of the room above could be placed over it. This is the bottom floor of a 3-story structure. Then at the late Homol'ovi phase, depopulation closure of a structure, it looks very different. You see here the enriched deposits are on the floor or near the floor within 10 centimeters of the floor. And in this case, look at the number of monos we have down here, 47 monos, 4 matadis, 3 piki stones. So this is the assemblage we would expect that they're leaving behind for their long distance migration. And interestingly, as in an earlier structure, the kiva that had the ash cone and then was burned, we have this 10 centimeter thick layer of ash placed over this room. It's had to have been done many, many years after the room was no longer used and the people left. So somebody came back concerned about the power of this room and made sure that they protected whoever came later by burying it with this ash layer. This is a ridiculous slide, I recognize. I just wanted to show you the data we're tracking. And we identified 10 rooms with hearths, not including kivas, that had a lot of stuff in them and a lot of unusual features in them that suggest they may be special rooms. The attributes we use to identify these distinctive rooms include the floor features they have, how many layers of plaster they have, how many enriched deposits they contained, whether roofs were burned or there were thick ashy cultural deposits involved, their connection to other rooms and how many, and did these rooms have or hearths or not, the number and variety of rare and unusual objects outside of enriched deposits, size of the rooms, and when they were used and filled, and whether they were upper or lower story rooms. And these are the 10 rooms that were found to stand out with these attributes. Summarizing them by time, 7 of the 10 rooms were filled in the the late Homol'ovi phase. And these are dominated by ground stone, as illustrated in that one room that I showed you. In fact, monos are the most frequent object in every late Homol'ovi phase room because of the long distance migration. Objects also fit the gender of the room and rooms in these cases, and ash in the form of heavy cultural enrichment and layers for protection of the future are present in these rooms because the rooms are still viable. Even if the community is no longer occupied, the rooms are still living entities. 2 of the 10 rooms were filled in the early Homol'ovi phase. These have very diverse assemblages filled with lots of rare and unusual objects associated with the repurposing of the space, converting it from room blocks to plazas. And most of this repurposing is being done in storage rooms, or perhaps some of them are religious storage rooms. 4 of the 10 rooms were also filled in the middle Homol'ovi phase, which is very similar to the early Homol'ovi phase. 8 of these 10 rooms had heavy ashy cultural deposition with enriched deposits. 6 are adjacent to a room with a high number of plaster layers. And all of these rooms are either habitation or religious ritual structures connected to religious storage structures. And so these room sets are likely clan houses or parts of clan houses. And this is where they're located at Homol'ovi I. Spread, not surprisingly, out across the village. Again, we didn't excavate in every part of the village. The ones that are circled are the ones that have the highest status in terms of all these measurements. And you'll notice that they're located similarly with respect to the pueblos that they're part of. In a higher elevation area next to a plaza space here on the northeast corner of the room block, and here in an elevated space in the northeast corner of the South Pueblo. Not accidental. So I think these are where the most important people lived, highest status, and the clan houses are located. These are where the dedicatory rooms are located that were used for constructing the plaza spaces. These are the 2 most studied of those rooms. So In conclusion, almost all cultural deposits have social meaning, but that meaning is understood only when contextualized in space and time. Those with exceptionally unusual and diverse artifact assemblages likely point to rooms that were most meaningful to occupants of the community. This is especially true if the deposits either include ash or are covered with ash. Ash is associated with objects and spaces having social or ritual power. Objects and the nature of deposits tell a history of Homol'ovi I and its founding, its reorganization and depopulation, and where community and religious leaders likely lived. These Homol'ovi Pavansinome were more common in Homol'ovi I because they were early migrants with primary lineages who founded the largest village, controlled important ceremonies, and farmed the most productive land, and did so for 100 years. And a few thank yous. And thank you very much for hanging in there and listening in. And I will let you read the thank yous. Want to acknowledge Rich Lang in particular, who's been stuck with me for 40 years as the associate director of the project, and acknowledge this woman and also these other volunteers, Kathy Michael, who volunteered for us for about 25 years. And I mean volunteered. She was there day and night for the whole length of every field season. Also want to acknowledge 3 graduate students, Bill Walker, Vin Lamont, and Sam Plaid, who contributed to my learning and growth and learning about deposits and their social meaning. Thank you. So shall I go ahead and read the question? And then in terms of enriched deposits, where macaw was evidence of macaws found. We found 2 macaws. Neither of them at Homol'ovi I. They were both, interestingly enough, found at the smallest village, Homol'ovi III, and they were part of a bird cemetery that we uncovered at Homol'ovi III. That was probably being used by people coming over from Homol'ovi I and using Homol'ovi III as a farming village. So it's related to Homol'ovi I, but we have 2 interments at Homol'ovi III. That was from Libby Beck. Another one from Libby Beck. Regarding the painted wood objects, would you expand on their use and what they look like? Well, there's not much of them preserved. The only part that's preserved is that which is painted with green paint, which is copper derived, and that prevents bacterial growth. So for the most part, they were probably parts of tabletas or some element of a handle or something to a rattle or something like that. But we don't have clear indications of what the actual objects were used for because they're so poorly preserved in such small pieces. But they're almost always found in enriched deposits. Mary Graham, is ash used today in Hopi villages similar to how you found ash in Homol'ovi? Yes. Yeah, it is used in Hopi villages. I should mention also that ash is used on living humans. Hopi use ash as a protectant during some times of the year. So it's still very important. And of course, ash is part of a lot of modern ceremonies and rituals too. Brendan Coverdale, when would an additional plaster layer be applied? Was it primarily associated with room purpose changes? I need to scroll down, or just periodically for upkeep reasons, the old plaster began falling off. Room plaster was, there are probably 2 types of uses, times when plaster was added. In habitation rooms, it was probably often added when the walls just became too sooty and they just needed a refreshing. In religious structures, they might have been replastered for each major ceremonial activity that was going to take place in that space, or to cover up murals or something else that was drawn on the wall. But they're always covering soot at some point. So in the kivas or religious ritual structures, if they're not being used more than once a year, they would be used annually to cover up the soot that's accumulated. Also from Brandon, when important social religious rooms were filled in, mentioned the ash was likely dumped through the ceiling from above. Were the rooms likely not entered by people? Once again, it was decided to seal them up. Sometimes roofs were removed from structures and repurposed, and then rooms were just filled without roofs. Oftentimes, they began to be filled through hatchways or through doorways. And when that began to happen, those rooms were not being used again. They had gone into the afterlife. Anytime deposits start to accumulate, that room has changed from the living part of its existence to the afterlife, the archaeological part of its existence. Do volcano memory have influence in ash covering? Do volcano memory? I don't think so. I've not thought about that. I think that Barbara Roth and I published an edited volume on ash deposits, and about 3 years ago, and it included chapters by people all over the US and into Mexico who looked at how ash was being used in their regions. And it was being used in very similar ways across the whole US and probably across the world. So I think the association of ash with burning and the transformational power of fire, which is, I think, what ash represents, its transformative evidence is what is being done. It's not really related to volcanoes. That was anonymous, by the way. Marglyph barrier. What were the ages of the macaw remains? Well, if you mean the birds themselves, I think they were about 9 months or 10 months. The period of time that they were interred was about 1375. Why were rooms abandoned or destroyed and filled? Was it practical or a matter of reverence or personal to the previous occupants? This is from Scott again. There are a number of reasons. Sometimes rooms just get to be too old. Some of those habitation rooms and the villages at Hopi, Ribe that were documented were just too old to live in anymore. They've been they're hundreds of years old, and so they're allowed to fall down, and then they're filled in. In some cases, something significant happened in the room, causing the people to not want to live there any longer. Perhaps somebody passed away there, or some other bad event happened in there. So the room, in those cases, a lot of ash is going to be placed in the room. It's going to have some perhaps power that's negative to the community or to the family. And then when people leave an area, of course, they often put material in the floors of rooms, but they usually don't fill the rooms. Todd Bradley, did decommissioning of rooms include burials, animal or otherwise, along with the other materials deposited? In the Homol'ovi villages, human remains were not used burials were not used as the closing of rooms, unlike areas like Membris. Animals were sometimes part of the closing of rooms, decommissioning of rooms. We see a fair number of cottontail rabbits, in particular, whole ones. We see articulated paws and hands and things like that that are probably part of skins that were being left. And from John Welch, thanks for the fascinating presentation and the innovative and diligent work. Follow your inferences about room economic and social functions, but I haven't grasped the concept of room space social identities. To have social roles and relationships, wouldn't each of the rooms have to have a unique identity? Are you able to say more about whether each of the spaces in each of the categories has a separate and distinct identity, or that they may not have been separate but were sequential in time, like a mother, daughter, granddaughter, or uncle, nephew, grandnephew? Maybe a better way to ask the question is how room space identities are distinct from other kinds of social identities. Well, I think it's rooms at Homol'ovi I, each one is distinctive, but related to the identities of the people who were filling them, and the status of those individuals and the relationships they had to the room, whether they were direct descendants of that room or whether they're lineage related or whatever, and what ceremonies were taking place in the room. Each ritual at Hopi, for instance, every ritual has its own distinct objects that are associated with it. So I think the vast majority of rooms would be as distinctive as human beings, but I think as archaeologists, we would be hard pressed to recognize those distinctions in some cases, and then those nuances. So I guess that would be my answer, is that they probably were unique. And if you were to go to Hopi today and talk to Hopi, they would consider spaces unique and having a certain identity, but not every space is going to have that much attention to it, depending on the status and the power of the individuals who are filling that room. Scott, was the breaking of matatis part of abandoning an area for migration? No, matatis were not broken. I mean, they may have broken from use, but they were not purposely broken. Many of the matatis were quite thick and would have been very difficult to break. I guess you could drop them from a distance, but no, they were not. And that is the last question. Give people another 30 seconds to ask anything else. Otherwise, I think we're finished. Thanks everybody for your questions. John, you and I can talk more, John Welch, about these things if you'd like. And appreciate the questions and everybody's time. Thank you, Sebastian, for hosting.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. There is no lecture next month. So the next one is going to be February 2025. I'll see you guys in February. Thank you.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays, right.